The history of Shadowfiend, and to a lesser extent, MindBender. Shadowfiend was added in the Burning Crusade. In its first form, it was a short duration pet that only lived for 15 seconds, and would give the priest mana based on 250% of the damage it did. So the more damage you were able to get your fiend to do, the more mana you got back. Shadowfiend was a baseline ability, so all 3 specs of priest got to use it. The healing priest just used it for its mana, and Shadow Priest, well, they used it for its mana too, but they could get it to do a little bit more damage. It didn't hit super hard and had a 5-minute cooldown, so it basically was just a mana cooldown. Because of the way buffs worked on pets, getting the full use out of a short duration pet was tricky. It gained benefits from the priest just like any normal pet, but since it wasn't out all the time like other pets, priests had to worry about a few things that other normal pet classes didn't, like when to summon it for bloodlust. Back in the day, pets could be buffed. There was even special food buffs just for pets. What this meant was they also got short duration buffs like bloodlust, and could double dip from raid-wide buffs, since they get a little benefit from sharing stats with their owners, and they got the full effect from having it cast on them. But since the fiend only existed for 15 seconds, priests had to predict, or time, when to summon the fiend, since they wanted it to double dip from bloodlust for as long as possible. So ideally, they'd summon the pet a split second before bloodlust was cast. Of course, if you cast it after bloodlust is already out, it won't gain double benefit. Shaman had to deal with this as well with ghost wolves, but those lasted longer than Shadowfiends, had smaller cooldowns, and could be used by a class that could use bloodlust. Now, why go through all that effort just to double dip from bloodlust? Well, because it meant more attacks, and Shadowfiends have always given mana based on how many hits they get in. Even though the Shadowfiend dealt pure shadow damage with its attacks, they were still counted as melee hits, meaning you could be blocked, dodged, parried, and deal glancing blows, which would lower the amount of mana you can get back. So some thought was needed on who to cast the fiend on to get the maximum amount of hits. When Shadowfiend was given its pet bar for the first time in patch 2.1, the Shadowfiend would be summoned in defensive stance by default, and would sometimes just stand there when summoned rather than attack right away. With a pet that's all about maximizing the amount of hits you can muster, this was a pretty big deal. A few ways to deal with it was to simply switch it to aggressive stance on a target dummy. That way it would stay that way when you next summoned it, or create a macro with a line/pet attack in it so that it would attack right away, since aggressive stance wasn't really a good idea to use back then. For those of you who don't remember, aggressive stance used to be a mode that you could set your pet in that would basically treat your pet like a hostile mob, who would attack anything that was close by no matter whether their master was attacking anything or not. So if a target died while your pet was in aggressive stance, it could just wander to its next closest target instead of returning to your side and pull extra mobs or break CC. In Wrath of the Lich King, Shadowfiend got a few updates. For one, it now gave back 5% of your maximum mana every time it landed a hit, rather than mana based on how much damage it did. This overall gave more mana back since all it had to do was land attacks now. But you no longer got back huge amounts of mana for attacking a vulnerable mob or boss. It also gained an ability called Shadow Crawl. Shadow Crawl gave the Shadowfiend the ability to teleport behind the target and gave it a 15% damage boost for 5 seconds, all on a 6-second cooldown. By default, the Shadowfiend uses this ability on cooldown. It makes it so the fiend can stick to bosses and do ad switching much more effectively than it could in the past, when it didn't have any kind of mobility. Or I might say, that's what should have happened, but the Shadowfiend rarely ever actually casted the ability himself, even when it was on autocast. So many priests would just macro the ability into their normal rotations to make sure that their Shadowfiend used it off cooldown, and as soon as it was summoned. It did, however, eventually start using the ability itself, and still does to this day. Shadow Priests at this point also gained some neat talents that allowed them to use their fiends more often. They had a talent that just straight up reduced its cooldown by a minute, and another one that would reduce its cooldown even further by 10 seconds every time Mind Flay crit, which happened often, seeing as Mind Flay was a channeled spell that priests used way more than any other ability, giving Shadow Priests a somewhat regular shadowy pet to use. In Cataclysm, the pet was changed slightly. It now only gave back 3% of your maximum mana per hit instead of 5%, But this was also around the time Blizzard started tuning down healers big time and didn't want them to have basically unlimited mana. Fun little fact about Cataclysm healers: Blizzard nerfed all the healing classes so hard that healers actually got weaker as they leveled up from 80 to 85, as mana cost for spells would double or triple, with their mana pools not getting anywhere near as big to compensate. Blizzard backtracked so hard after the first major patch in Cataclysm that it's almost comical looking back on it. Rest assured, towards the end of the expansion, all healers were back to spamming heals with little mana problems like they had in the past. But anyway, about Shadowfiend. Since Shadowfiend was a major source of mana for healing priests, priests still used it off cooldown like normal when they were low on mana. But they also went out of their way to increase their mana pools with short duration buffs and trinkets to get the full benefit of Shadowfiend. One of the most common tactics healing priests did was to use Shadowfiend and then immediately after it was out, start channeling Hymn of Hope, which would give other casters with the lowest mana pools a temporary buff that would increase their mana pool, as well as give 3% mana back with each tick, allowing the priest to basically get back half their mana pool as well as a little bit of extra mana to other healers. And as for Shadow Priests, this was also around the time Blizzard stopped making mana a resource for all casters to manage, and basically made it so non-arcane mage casters would be able to last a full fight without worrying about running out of mana. So Shadowfiend was basically just a cool looking damage cooldown that did mediocre damage. But then again, Shadow Priests were always the most mana efficient caster class in the game, so it didn't really change much for them. Now, there were no significant changes to Shadowfiend for the rest of Cataclysm, but Shadow Priests did get two different set bonuses that affected Shadowfiend in a big way. The first being the Firelands Tier 12 2-set bonus, which gave the Shadowfiend 20% bonus damage as fire damage, and reduced its cooldown by 75 seconds. Now, pretty much all of the set bonuses had some kind of fiery theme to them, and the one for Shadow Priests was just to give their Shadowfiend bonus fire damage, which is neat and everything, but it was a 75-second cooldown reduction that was the good part. In fact, it was so good that Disc and Holy Priests were using it over their 4-set bonuses, until Blizzard changed the 2-set bonus to only activate while the priest was in shadow form. Shadow Priest still had the talents to make the cooldown of Shadowfiend be 4 minutes instead of 5, and the ability to lower its cooldown by 10 seconds every time they crit with Mind Flay. So, with an additional minute and 15 seconds knocked off the cooldown, Shadow Priests were able to use their little fiery pets a lot more often in Firelands. Then comes Tier 13 with Dragon Soul, and Shadow Priests get a 4-set bonus that affects Shadowfiend. The 4-set bonus would grant the priests 3 Shadow Orbs every time the Shadowfiend or Shadowy Apparition did damage. Now, most people at the time complained about this 4-set bonus, and a lot of people waited a long time before giving up their Firelands 2-set bonus to get this 4-set. To really give you the full picture of how this 4-set worked, I have to tell you a little bit about how Shadow Priest worked at the time. You see, Shadow Priest's master at the time was Shadow Orbs, which could stack up to 3, and would increase the damage of your next Mind Blast or Mind Spike by a large amount, and consume all orbs when you did. Mind Blast was part of the normal rotation, so Shadow Orbs is like a passive mechanic you didn't really have to think about, kind of like the Frost Mage's Mastery Icicles. And Mind Spike, the other ability Shadow Orbs could boost the damage of, didn't have a cooldown like Mind Blast, hit decently hard, and gave the target a debuff which would increase the critical strike chance of your next Mind Blast on them by like 30% per cast. But each cast of Mind Spike cleared all your dots off the target, and Shadow Priest did about half their damage of their dots, so Mind Spike was not used very often, if at all. But in comes the Tier 13 4-set bonus, with Shadowfiend giving 3 orbs with every attack. Usually, you gather orbs very slowly throughout the fight passively with other effects, but the 4-set gave you 3 orbs pretty much every second for 15 seconds on demand. With Mind Blast having a cooldown, it didn't seem very useful, but it was incredibly useful if used with Mind Spike spam. For the 15 seconds the Shadowfiend was out, Shadow Priest had what they had never had before, burst damage, and it was really good burst damage. But Mind Spike spam interrupted your normal rotation, so it was only really useful at the start of fights, and during periods where you needed to burst down a high priority ad. And you know what Dragon Soul had? Spine of Deathwing, the fight with the highest amount of burst damage ever needed for a boss fight. Burst damage was so valuable in this fight, it was better to bring a class with high burst damage and LFR gear than a heroic geared class with medium to no burst. And thanks to the 4-set bonus, Shadow Priests only got sat out on World First Rate teams, because even with the high burst the 4-set gave them, there were other classes that had good burst and better survivability, like Fire Mages and Sub-Rogues. Alright, now into Mist of Pandaria. In Mist, Shadow Priest had its cooldown lowered to 3 minutes by default, and everything else stayed pretty much the same, save the removal of Shadow Priest talents that lowered its cooldown further. Mist is also when MindBender was introduced to the game. MindBender is a talent that would replace Shadowfiend and summoned a floating pet instead. That did less damage and only gave back 1% mana per hit rather than 3%, but on a shorter cooldown than the Shadowfiend. Now, there was a lot of debate in Mist as to whether Shadowfiend gave back more mana than MindBender, and the short answer was that if you wanted to free up global cooldowns, MindBender was the better option to take, and MindBender has remained a very popular choice since. Although for Shadow Priest it was kind of a terrible choice, since all it did was give back mana, and the other two talent choices were a ton better for actually doing damage. So Shadow Priest kept using the good old Shadowfiend, even if the healing specs didn't. There was also a thing at this time called Shaw-touched weapons that dropped from some raids, and one of the weapons had an effect that would change the appearance of Shadowfiend and MindBender to that of a Shaw Beast. Later on, they added a glyph to the game which did exactly what the weapons did. So now you know the origin of the Shaw glyph. It was once a neat little cosmetic effect given by a weapon. Although I don't advise using the glyph if you choose MindBender, as the Shaw Beast crawls on the floor just like the Shadowfiend, and this can slow it down on some terrain that the MindBender who floats in the air would just ignore, causing a loss in hits in very rare circumstances. Now on to Warlords. In Warlords, Shadowfiend was changed to no longer give back mana on hits. The first time in its history of being an ability, it was changed to just a damage cooldown instead of a hybrid damage/mana cooldown. This change was most likely made because Blizzard got rid of pretty much all other mana cooldowns as well, meaning healers didn't really have to keep track of mana cooldowns anymore and just focus on healing. I say that, but the changes to MindBender don't really hold up to that philosophy. MindBender was changed to be the dominating one in the Shadowfiend partnership. MindBender had its mana return nerfed to be only 0.75 mana return on each hit, but it lasted for 20 seconds, while the Shadowfiend only lasted 12 seconds, and only did about 10% less damage per hit than the Shadowfiend, when in the past it did about 2/3 the damage of the Shadowfiend. Shadowfiend kind of lost its place amongst the healing priests, since it was just a mana-free damage cooldown, but was still the go-to pet for Shadow Priest since MindBender was still pretty awful for them. Well, until tier 18 came along anyway. The Hellfire Citadel bonuses essentially lowered the cooldown of both MindBender and Shadowfiend, so that as soon as the MindBender's 20 seconds were over, its cooldown was back up, turning it into a quasi-permanent pet. For Shadowfiends though, its cooldown duration didn't line up as nicely as MindBender, so it couldn't be up 100% of the time, but it could be up for like 90% of the time. The 4-set bonus also gave Shadow Priest a nice buff when the Shadowfiend and MindBender ended, meaning you absolutely wanted to use them off cooldown, even if they wouldn't be able to attack for their full durations. Now, on to current WoW and Legion. Shadowfiend saw no real changes, other than Holy Priest no longer being able to use it, but they removed pretty much all shadow spells from Holy, so it's not that surprising. As for MindBender, well, that too is only for Disc and Shadow, and works a little bit differently for each spec. For Disc, it's basically the same, it gives back mana every time it hits something, and for Shadow, it lasts a little longer and gives insanity every time it hits something. This is also the first time that MindBender has given something other than mana. Even back when Shadow Priests were using Shadow Orbs as their quasi-resource, MindBender still only gave mana back, which made it pretty useless to Shadow Priests for 2 expansions. But now it's actually a legitimate option to take. And that's it for the history of Shadowfiend, and to a lesser extent MindBender. If you have an idea for another one of these kinds of videos, just let me know and I might make it.